Very pleased today to have Christopher Burr, Master of Wine, with a long and prestigious and continuing name in the wine industry. Today we want to talk about mainly your kind of recollections with regards to champagne, aging champagne, especially on lease and on cork, and your kind of stories with regards to Christie's wine auctions. So Christopher, you've got some fascinating stories. I've spoken to you a few times actually. Fascinating stories, and I've got a collection of notes here. One of those things is to do with Krug 1928 vintage.
Do you know how I started my love of champagne? Well before that. I think I was 6.5 or 7. My father had been a soldier during the war, and he ended up as liaison officer between the American Army, the British Army, and actually the Free French. And when they got to Paris, the liaison officer for the Free French under de Gaulle was a man called Victor Lanson.
Okay, Victor Lanson, yeah.
And Victor Lanson and father became good friends. And so as kids, we used to go and stay with the Lanson family. And I remember being taken to what I now know as a Van Clair tasting, aged about 6 or 7, and able to taste, because Victor was showing my father how they made their wines, the component parts of their blend, and then the final wine. And that just, as a youngster, just impressed me so much. I never forgot it. I can remember it as though it was yesterday.
You started very early, Christopher.
Yes, I was forced to spit it out, of course. But yeah, but it is interesting. I mean, it did fire my imagination, and then I was lucky enough to go and work with the Krug family as their brand manager here in the UK. And 28 you mentioned. I remember staying with Remy in Reims and him bringing out a bottle of 28 and thinking, gosh, that's wonderful. And my kids were playing, they had in Remy's kitchen, the kids had a little cookery thing. And I remember one of the kids went to the fridge to bring out a bottle of water, and the water was served in a bottle painted with wonderful flowers and things like that, which was another champagne house, but Remy used to put the water in that and keep it in the fridge, so we had nice fresh water. Anyway, they played, and that was Olivier and my eldest son playing together. And anyway, that evening, I think Remy thought it was a good occasion, and he wanted to show me what they did. So he brought out a wine that had never been shipped straight from the cellars. It never shipped because of the war, and the cellars were sealed off, and the wine was never shipped for financial, political, and all sorts of other reasons. And it was the 28, and it was the most extraordinary wine, never left the cellars. Very memorable. Big, concentrated, and with age, wonderfully complex, and still wonderful acidity. And I wonder what it's like now. Anyhow, then later, we created a thing called the Krug Awards of Excellence. And for people who'd done really wonderful things in their careers and their lives. It could be in the sports world, in the arts, in business, even in politics. We gave awards to people who'd done amazing things. And we were sitting around saying, well, you know, when we give these awards, we can give them some wonderful magnums of Krug. And I think Remy decided that we still got some 53 Krug, which was, no, it wasn't a 53, but it was it was magnums of Krug that he sent to Her Majesty the Queen for the coronation in 1953. And I can't actually remember what vintage it was, but he had some of those left. And so we used to send that, but then we thought we ought to do something else. And one of our PR guys, who was in the arts world, had met the agent for Salvador Dali. And so we were going down to Figueras to brief Mr. Daly on creating something as the Krug Award of Excellence. And Remy said to me, well, we should take some champagne down. What should we take? And I said, well, you have to take a bottle of the 28 and explain the history of what you're doing. It's quite special. I think I've never met Daly before, but I'm sure he'd be interested. And yes, he was. And the rest is history.
Well, you and I today are sharing a bottle of 1979 Veuve Clicquot Côte d'Or from Champagne Collectors. What's your feelings on this wine here? So for me, it's got wonderful colour and the nose is very vibrant, despite it being nearly 50 years old.
The great thing about this wine is it's still got lovely acidity. And acidity is the best preservative of everything. I mean, when you think the great preservatives in wine are alcohol, I guess this is what, 12 or 13%, 12 now probably. Sugar, well, this will have 5 grams probably, I don't know. It's not that sweet, but it's got enough residual sugar to give it roundness, but still tastes dry. So I would say 4 or 5 grams of residual sugar, and then but the great preservative is acidity, and this has still got acidity, which is giving it longevity. So 79, how old is that?
Well, it is 44
years old
of age, yes.
So nearly as old as me.
Yeah, nearly as much, a bit older than me, but dare I say.
But it's still lovely. I mean, it's still got fruit. It's starting to get umami, which is what I love.
Umami, I that word signifies you, and very much your same passion as what I have. You love wines that are either aged in a bottle or especially least aged, and champagnes. So you also worked in Christie's wine auction, so you must have seen some really old classics there.
Gosh, yes. In fact, in the year 2000, we did a sale for all the great champagne houses to show off what they wanted to sell. We did it in New York. It was a hugely successful sale. I don't know, 10 million or something. I remember getting a sharp note from the guy who was responsible for Lanson because I hadn't written a nice enough note about his wines. But we did very well, and we tasted some fantastic wines. But I suppose some of the most memorable wines are the ones with history. And there was, of course, the 1907 Heidsieck Monopole, Goût Américain, and Goût Américain means high dosage. I mean, sweet wine, effectively, a sweet champagne, which was being sent to the Cossack regiments in Helsinki in 1916 during the First World War, and the Cossacks liked sweet champagne. Russian aristocrats liked sweet champagne, and this was being sent from Copenhagen to Helsinki across the Baltic. And it was on a ship called the Jönköping. And the Jönköping was sunk by the U-2, the second U-boat ever built by the Germans. And the U-2 sunk the Jönköping. And I don't think they realised what was on it, otherwise they'd have taken it. But anyway, it was sunk. And I can't remember, 1998, I was involved in recovering the wine from the Jönköping at 60 metres down. And that was quite important, 60 metres down, because the pressure at 60 metres down was probably more than the pressure inside the bottle. So it kept the fizz. Interestingly, the corks almost went flat because the pressure was so high at 60 metres down, the water pressure. But not only that, it was so cold as well, 60 metres down in the Baltic. It was very cold, so it was preserved perfectly. The only problem was, as we brought the bottles up, the corks popped out because the wire holding the corks in had eroded or disintegrated. And so we had to send divers down to put a little grappoir over the top of the cork just to keep the corks in so they didn't pop out as soon as they came up. And we managed to do that with, I think, about 2,000 bottles. And we were rather nervous about what it tasted like until I first tasted it, and it was extraordinary because the sugar the colour and the freshness were like it was a young champagne, and the bubbles were like it was a young champagne. Extraordinary. This was in 1998, I think, and yet the wine had aged. It developed complexity. It developed all sorts of interesting tastes and flavours. And the sugar levels had dropped a bit, which is quite normal. I mean, with wine, often the sugar levels drop a bit. But the sugar, you see, as I said, the things that preserve wine are acidity, alcohol, and sugar, like you would if you're cooking. You know, you make jam, it lasts for a long time. If you pickle stuff in vinegar, acidity, it lasts a long time. And this wine had really lasted well. I mean, it was extraordinarily good. So we brought it up and we did a tasting at Christie's, and I invited all the wine journalists and all the people involved in understanding great wine, and they all came and they were amazed by it, and you know, people still talk about it. It was an extraordinary tasting because they were blown away by the fizz, by the complexity, by the youthfulness of this wine. And then it sold, I mean, I'm going back a bit, so 1998, it sold for about £2,000 a bottle, which was actually quite a lot in those days. God knows what it would sell for these days. But
if there's any left still.
Well, I don't know whether there's any left, but what happened was interesting. A lot we sold to Caviar House.
Oh, yes.
And Caviar House served it as one of the special wines they serve alongside their caviar in the duty free and one or two other places. And after about 3 or 4 months, the wine started to deteriorate quite badly. It started to lose fizz. I suppose the corks weren't tight, and started to oxidize slightly, and it didn't last long. But I mean, you know, I can understand that. But when it was first brought out within a few months, it was absolutely extraordinary. So that was the moment.
That was the moment to cherish, I think. When
it was extraordinary. And you know, the great joy of wine is discovering something different and new and variable. And every day I learn something new.
That's a beautiful. Yeah, that's a beautiful quote there. It is true. You continue to learn.
Yeah.
You can spend a lifetime and more discovering. One last question, and I don't expect you to specify one wine only, but the best ever champagne that you've tasted, Christopher.
Gosh,
that
is about the hardest. Because as I go through life, my best wine I've ever tasted changes. At the moment, I'm passionate about Clos de Gouas from Philippina. I find it such an intriguing wine, and such a every time I taste a different vintage, it surprises me. There is a complexity there and a masculinity there, I think, probably is the right word, which I don't think exists in any other champagne. And so it's surprising. And I think it's a food wine. But I think my passion is still Krug, because I worked there and I understand the wine very well. I remember something quite extraordinary. I had a client at Christie's called Joshua Latner. He was a very lovely man. Oh, he's still a very lovely man. I haven't seen him for a long time. And he decided to give a tasting or a dinner in the Place de Vendôme in Paris, where he lives, showing some of the greatest wines in the world. And he said, "Christopher, what are we going to show?" And I said, "Well, in your cellar you've got some pretty good wines, but you've got a big collection of 61, which was your birth year. He was born in 1961. So I said, why don't we do from 1861 to 1961, the best vintages of different wines? It could be an interesting tasting." And so, I mean, what I found interesting was wines ending in one. When you think of 21, you think of 31 port, into Noval, Nacional 31. You think of 41's difficult. You have to go to California for 41. So I went to Burr Vineyard, and they made a fabulous 41. 51, my birth year, was again difficult, and again I had to go to California. But 21, I knew the guy who was running Moet in Champagne, and so I rang him up and I told him what we were doing. And he disgorged half a dozen bottles of 21 Moet, which was in those days, it was their top cuvée, which subsequently became Dom Perignon. In the 30s, when they launched Dom Perignon, it was their top cuvée. I can't remember what it was called, but he disgorged 21 wine, and it was extraordinarily good. And he disgorged it especially for that evening. And that was pretty memorable, I have to say. It was a wonderful wine.
Wow, Christopher. Well, Christopher Burr, MW, thank you very much for the words that you've shared with us. Very enlightening. Thank you very much, sir.
I'm pleased to share my love.